The soft hum of a vacuum filled the grand living room, its melody lost in the vastness of marble floors and crystal chandeliers. The billionaire, Alexander Pierce, barely noticed the sound as he sat in his leather chair, staring blankly at the fire crackling in the oversized fireplace. His mind was elsewhere, buried in the past, in memories he never dared to revisit. He had everything a man could want: wealth beyond imagination, a sprawling estate, power, influence, but none of it filled the emptiness that had settled in his chest over the years. He had long since accepted that some things were simply lost to time, that some wounds never truly healed. And then it happened. A voice, soft at first, then rising with warmth, cut through the silence like a blade through glass. A song he hadn't heard in decades. Alexander's entire body stiffened. His breath caught in his throat. That melody, those lyrics, impossible. His heart pounded as he slowly turned toward the sound. Across the room, standing by the staircase with a dusting cloth in her hand, was Evelyn Carter. She was one of the housemaids, a quiet woman who had worked in the mansion for just under a year. He had never paid much attention to her before. She did her work efficiently, always polite, always professional, but now, as her voice carried through the room, it was as if the world had tilted on its axis. She wasn't just singing any song. She was singing his song, the one that had been buried with his past, locked away with memories too painful to relive, a song that had once defined his entire world, before everything had crumbled. Alexander pushed himself up from the chair, barely aware of his own movement. His pulse roared in his ears. "Where did you hear that?" His voice was hoarse, almost unrecognizable. Evelyn froze, startled by the sudden break in the usual silence between them. Her eyes widened. "Sir?" "The song," he repeated, stepping closer. "Where did you hear it?" She hesitated, confused by the intensity in his gaze. I don't know. My grandmother used to sing it to me when I was little." His stomach dropped. "Your grandmother?" "Yes." She gave a small, nervous smile, as if unsure why this was even a conversation. She used to hum it while she cooked. "I always thought it was beautiful." Alexander felt dizzy. His fingers curled into his palms. This couldn't be happening. There was no way, no possible way, that this song had found its way back to him like this. Because that song wasn't just a song. It was a piece of his past, a link to someone he had lost, someone he had loved more than life itself. And if Evelyn's grandmother had known it, then that meant, he swallowed hard, his voice barely above a whisper. "What was your grandmother's name?" Evelyn's brows knitted together at the odd question, but she answered anyway. "Margaret Carter." The room spun. Alexander staggered, back a step, gripping the armrest of his chair for support. The name crashed into a wave, dragging him under, stealing the air from his lungs. He hadn't heard that name in more than 30 years. Margaret Carter, the woman who had once meant everything to him, the woman he had loved with every fiber of his being, the woman he had lost. And now, standing before him, was her granddaughter, singing the song that had once been their song. His heart pounded in his chest, the weight of the moment pressing down on him. This wasn't just a coincidence. It couldn't be. Fate had a cruel way of working. And suddenly, Alexander realized his past wasn't as buried as he had thought. Evelyn watched her employer with growing concern. His face had gone pale, his usually sharp and unreadable expression replaced by something raw, something shaken. She had never seen him like this before. Alexander Pierce was a man of control, a man who never let anything slip. But now, he looked like he had seen a ghost. I'm sorry, sir," Did I do something wrong? She asked carefully. Alexander barely heard her. His mind was spinning, tangled in memories that had long been locked away. Margaret Carter. He had spent years trying to forget that name, and yet, hearing it now brought everything rushing back. He remembered the warmth of a summer evening, the distant hum of music, and the way Margaret's laughter used to fill the air. She had been everything to him. His love, his future, his escape from a world that had always felt cold and distant. But back then, things were different. He wasn't the billionaire he was now. He had been just a young man, trapped in a life that had already been mapped out for him, expected to follow the rules of wealth and status. Margaret had changed everything. She had taught him to see the world differently, to love without conditions. But his family hadn't approved. She wasn't one of them, they had said. And in the end, he had let them win. He had walked away from her, convincing himself it was for the best, that love wasn't enough to fight against the weight of expectations. And now, standing before him, was her granddaughter. Alexander forced himself to focus on the present. He needed answers. "Evelyn," he said, his voice steadier than he felt. "How well did you know your grandmother?" She hesitated, confused by his sudden interest. "She passed away when I was young, but my mother always talked about her. Said she was the kindest person you'd ever meet." A small smile crossed her lips. "She used to sing to me all the time. That song was one of her favorites." Alexander swallowed hard. Of course it was. It had been their song. He couldn't ignore what this meant. Evelyn wasn't just a stranger who happened to work in his house. She was connected to his past in ways she didn't even realize. And that terrified him. Because if she found out, if she knew who he had been to her grandmother, what would she think of him? But it wasn't just about Evelyn. It was about the past he had spent years trying to erase. A past that was suddenly standing in front of him, forcing him to confront everything he had run from. "Did she ever talk about her past?" he asked, his voice careful. Evelyn shrugged. "Not much. My mum said she had been in love once, a long time ago, but it ended badly." She sighed. She never talked about who he was, just that he broke her heart. Alexander's chest tightened. He didn't need to hear more. He already knew how the story ended. Margaret had never moved on. He had left her, and she had carried that pain for the rest of her life. Regret settled deep in his bones. Evelyn, still unaware of the storm raging inside him, tilted her head. "Why are you asking about her, Mr. Pierce?" He opened his mouth, then closed it. What could he say? That he had loved her grandmother and abandoned her when she needed him most. That he had spent his entire life pretending it hadn't mattered, only to find himself haunted by it now. Instead, he forced a tight smile. She just had a beautiful voice. It reminded me of something. Evelyn seemed to accept that answer, but there was still curiosity in her eyes. Over the next few days, Alexander found himself watching her more closely. He had spent years mastering the art of detachment, of keeping people at a distance. But now, every time Evelyn entered the room, it was like the past was walking alongside her. The way she moved, the warmth in her voice. There were pieces of Margaret in her, echoes of the woman he had once loved. And then, things took a turn. One evening, as he was walking past the kitchen, he overheard Evelyn talking on the phone. "I don't know, Mom. It's strange. He keeps asking about Grandma. It's like he knew her or something." There was a pause, and then Evelyn's voice softened. "Yeah, I miss her too." Alexander felt a lump in his throat. He knew he had to say something. Before, she put the pieces together on her own. The next day, he called her into his study. She looked nervous, like she was expecting to be reprimanded. Instead, he gestured to the chair across from him. "Sit." She did. her hands folded in her lap. "Is everything okay, sir?" He took a deep breath. "Evelyn, there's something I need to tell you." Her brows furrowed. "What is it?" His pulse pounded. He had spent decades running from this moment, but he couldn't hide anymore. He looked into her eyes, the same eyes that once belonged to Margaret. And then he said the words that would change everything. "I knew your grandmother." Evelyn blinked, confusion flickering across her face. You knew my grandmother." Alexander nodded slowly. His throat felt tight, his heart hammering against his ribs. He had spent so long burying the past, pretending it didn't matter. But now there was no escaping it. Evelyn deserved the truth. "I didn't just know her," he said quietly. "I loved her." Evelyn's eyes widened. She sat back in her chair, clearly stunned. "You loved my grandma?" Alexander swallowed, his fingers curling against the armrest of his chair. "A long time ago, before I became the man I am now." He hesitated, then forced himself to go on. "We were young. She was everything to me, but my family." He paused, exhaling sharply. "They didn't approve. They made it clear that if I stayed with her, I'd lose everything. And I was a coward. I chose my fortune over her." Evelyn was silent for a long moment, processing his words. When she finally spoke, her voice was softer, but there was something else there too. Hurt. "So you left her." The weight of those words settled heavily on his chest. He nodded. "Yes, and it was the worst mistake of my life." Evelyn looked away, her jaw tightening. "She never got over it, you know," she murmured. "She never told me much, but my mom used to say that there was someone in her past who broke her heart so badly, she never let herself love again." The guilt that Alexander had carried for years pressed down harder, suffocating. He had known, deep down, that he had hurt Margaret beyond repair, but hearing it now, from her granddaughter, made it real in a way it had never been before. "I wish I could take it back," he said, his voice raw. "I wish I could tell her how sorry I am." Evelyn stared at him, her expression unreadable. For the first time since she had stepped into his study, he realized just how much of Margaret was in her, not just in her voice or her eyes, but in the quiet strength she carried. A long silence stretched between them before she finally spoke. "Why are you telling me this now?" Alexander exhaled, running a hand through his hair. "Because I don't want to make the same mistake again. I don't want to keep running from the past. And because you deserve to know the truth." Evelyn nodded slowly, though her face remained unreadable. "I don't know how I feel about this," she admitted. "I grew up hearing about the man who hurt my grandmother, and now, finding out that man is you." She let out a shaky breath. "It's a lot to take in." "I understand," Alexander said quietly. "Take all the time you need." For a while, neither of them spoke. The only sound was the distant ticking of the grandfather clock in the corner. Alexander felt like he was holding his breath, waiting for her to say something, anything. Finally, Evelyn stood. "I should get back to work," he nodded, knowing there was nothing else he could say in this moment. He had given her the truth. What she did with it was up to her. Days passed. Evelyn kept her distance, going about her work in silence. Alexander didn't push. He had spent years living with regret. He could live with a little more if that's what she needed. Then one evening, as he sat alone in his study, he heard it again. The song, soft, steady, carrying through the quiet halls, like a whisper from the past. He stood, following the sound down the corridor until he reached the kitchen. Evelyn was there, her back to him as she wiped down the counter, humming the melody just as her grandmother once had. She turned when she noticed him, and for the first time in days, she didn't look away. "I've been thinking," she said, setting the cloth aside. "My grandma, she would have wanted me to forgive you." Alexander felt his chest tighten. "You don't have to. I know," she said simply. "But I think I want to." A silence passed between them, not heavy with tension, but with understanding. Evelyn let out a small, sad smile. "She never got to hear you say sorry, but I did, and maybe that's enough." Alexander nodded, his throat thick with emotion. Maybe it was. As Evelyn turned back to her work, humming the song once more, Alexander stood there for a moment longer, listening, not just to the music, but to the quiet sound of healing, the sound of the past finally making peace with the present. And for the first time in years, he felt something close to hope.